1889, Georgia. One son was born to inherit love, privilege, and protection. The other was born to endure scorn, harsh labor, and a constant reminder that he would never belong. On the small sun-baked farm, every glance and every word carved the line between them. The fair-skinned boy received warmth, encouragement, and the subtle shield of favor. The dark-skinned boy bore sharp words, long hours in the fields, and the unspoken decree that he existed only at the mercy of those who ruled the household. There was no subtlety in this hierarchy. It was deliberate, total, and impossible to ignore. From the earliest years, the disparity was impossible to miss. When the darker boy bent over the soil, hands blistered and back aching, every misstep was magnified. When the lighter boy stumbled, hands reached out, a gentle word offered, mistakes excused as though the sun itself had guided him. Silence became survival for the boy in shadow. Endurance became his shield, observation his only weapon. Each smile given to his brother cut like a hidden blade, shaping him in ways the house could not see. The village noticed. Whispers followed the family like wind over the dry fields. "The fair one will inherit everything," neighbors said. "The other? He survives only by keeping quiet." Within the walls of the farm, this was confirmed daily. Love could be measured, and cruelty could be precise. The dark-skinned boy understood his place without words, the discarded one, the shadow, the son unloved for the color of his skin as much as the accidents of birth. Years passed and the patterns hardened. The favored boy grew under constant attention, nourished in body and mind, given fertile soil, new clothes, and lessons that expanded both confidence and ambition. The scorned boy labored endlessly, denied recognition, punished for imagined failings, and forced to witness the inequality. Yet beneath the surface his mind sharpened quietly, calculating every injustice, filing each slight away for a future he could not yet name. Patience became his armor, observation his weapon, endurance his shield. The hierarchy became formal. Only one son would inherit the land, the family name and authority over the farm. The choice was unsurprising, always clear but absolute. The favored boy would carry the legacy. The other would remain overlooked, confined to the work and shadows he had known all his life. The reasoning was presented as necessity, but it was prejudice in practice, cruelty dressed as wisdom. From that day, the boundary between love and disdain was no longer subtle. It was etched into the rhythm of daily life. As the favored son grew, so did his confidence and entitlement. Praised for every act, shielded from failure, and told constantly of his worth. He learned that the world was his to command. The scorned son moved silently. Each insult and every act of favoritism internalized, transformed into understanding. He studied the mechanics of power and cruelty with a patience that could not yet be named, knowing that someday all of it might matter. Education reinforced the divide. Books and guidance were given to the favored son. The other was left with observation and the bare minimum of instruction. Questions were dismissed, curiosity punished, intelligence ignored. The world outside the farm mirrored the household, and he adapted. He learned to hide, to retreat, to endure, and to notice everything. Gestures, tones, subtle hierarchies, the smallest sign that power could be manipulated. The contrast in public life was equally clear. One son flourished in praise and opportunity. The other became a shadow, unnoticed yet acutely aware. Every act of indulgence shown to the favored son was a lesson in control. Every denial imposed on the other was a lesson in survival. The farm itself became a microcosm of injustice, fertile plots, warm meals and careful guidance for one, barren soil, grueling labor, and neglect for the other. And yet in silence, patience, and careful observation, the boy in shadow began to accumulate something the favored could not see. Quiet power. By the end of the decade, the division was absolute. The favored son had grown confident, proud and seemingly destined to inherit, unaware of the debt accumulating in silence beside him. The scorned son had grown lean, patient, and sharp. Every insult, every slight, every word of praise withheld, memorized, and filed away. The farm, orderly and scorched by the sun, bore the marks of this invisible war, one thriving in light, the other enduring in shadow, quietly waiting. Even as the favored son absorbed entitlement and the ease of approval, the scorned boy's intelligence deepened. He had endured countless injustices, hidden his resentment, and bided his time. Every act of favoritism, every withheld blessing, every correction had become part of a ledger he carried silently. Within that ledger, seeds of reckoning had already been sown. Patience and observation were cultivating a quiet storm, one that would confront the household in years to come. The dynamics of the household shaped identity with ruthless efficiency. The favored child believed himself untouchable, confident in his legacy and entitlement. The other became cautious, observant and calculating, learning not only the cruelty of his father, but the subtle operations of power itself. Every gesture, every tone, every small act reinforced lessons that could not be undone. The farm itself was a reflection of inequality, fertile plots, light praise, warmth for one, barren soil, shadow, punishment, and neglect for the other. In public and private, the lesson was clear. Favoritism and cruelty were intertwined, teaching obedience and compliance to one, resilience and patience to the other. Every act of indulgence for one and every punishment for the other shaped not just character but fate. The household, carefully ordered, was a study in selective love, precision, cruelty, and the inevitability of consequence. By the decade's end, the favored child had grown confident and entitled. The other had grown patient, observant, and strong in ways unseen. Every slight, every denied opportunity, every whispered judgment was remembered. The seeds of future reckoning, quiet but unshakable, had already been planted, invisible to those who believed cruelty could vanish without consequence. And though the favored boy thrived in light, the shadow beside him carried the knowledge of every debt owed and of the moment when it would be collected. As the years moved forward, the favored son, Thomas, grew taller, broader, and more assured. The very image of privilege nurtured from birth. Praise had shaped him as much as his father's careful guidance, and he carried it with the kind of confidence that blinded him to the shadows beside him. Every nod of approval, every small reward, every subtle indulgence reinforced a belief that the world itself had conspired to confirm his worth. To Thomas, the farm, the land, and even the opinions of the townspeople were tokens of his destiny, proof that he had been chosen for greatness. He walked with the ease of someone accustomed to being protected, shielded and loved above all else, never once questioning the unequal hands that had guided him to this position. Meanwhile, the boy who had endured, who had borne every insult, punishment, and act of neglect, had grown into a figure as quiet as he was observant. Jonah had become lean and strong, his muscles taut from endless labor, his mind sharper than anyone around him realized. He moved through the farm and the village like a shadow, silent yet acutely aware of everything, every gesture, every word, every nuance of behavior that might reveal opportunity or weakness. While Thomas's confidence made him bold and careless, Jonah's patience made him calculating and precise. Every act of favoritism shown to Thomas, every scolding he had suffered, every slight remembered, became a part of a mental ledger that would guide him in ways his father and brother could not foresee. The disparity in treatment continued unabated. Thomas received the best tools, the richest plots, and the attention of mentors who were summoned explicitly to nurture him. His successes were applauded, his failures excused. In the village, his name carried weight, associated with competence and prosperity. a reflection of the household's careful favoritism. Jonah, on the other hand, remained tied to the most grueling chores, tasked with work designed to exhaust both body and spirit, punished for errors that were never excused, and denied recognition that might encourage pride or hope. Yet in his endurance he grew in ways unseen. His strength was not loud. It was deliberate, patient, and methodical. As adolescence arrived, Thomas's entitlement deepened. He moved through the farm with the assurance of command, speaking freely, expecting obedience, rarely noticing the quiet figure who worked just a few steps behind him. He laughed easily at minor successes, absorbed every compliment as if it were his inherent right, and assumed that life would always unfold according to the advantages he had been given. His charm and ease masked an underlying arrogance, one sharpened by years of selective approval, and he never considered that his brother, the shadow beside him, might be more than a silent observer. Jonah, for his part, had long since abandoned hope for praise or affection. He understood that his father's favoritism was absolute, that Thomas's place was secure, and that any attempt to challenge the hierarchy directly would be punished severely. Instead, he cultivated a different kind of power, the power of patience, calculation, and timing. Every insult, every act of negligence, every slight was catalogued meticulously, stored for a day when it could serve purpose. He watched, always watched, learning patterns, habits, and vulnerabilities, knowing that the world often rewards the patient more than the bold. The household itself became a stage of constant contrasts. Meals were distributed with unspoken rules. Clothing, tools, and comforts followed invisible lines of privilege. Thomas was allowed indulgences, freshly laundered clothes, extra portions, and freedom from the hardest chores. Jonah was given only the bare necessities, the most grueling work and reminders of his inferiority. And yet he endured without complaint, his mind continuously at work, observing every detail, noting every weakness in those who believed themselves untouchable. In this endurance, he cultivated a quiet sense of inevitability, the knowledge that life's balance could shift in ways neither arrogance nor favoritism could prevent. Schooling, though rudimentary, further amplified the divide. Thomas's intelligence was praised, his questions encouraged, his achievements showcased. Jonah's intelligence, if noticed at all, was discouraged, suppressed, or ignored. But Jonah learned from observation, absorbing more than was expected, internalizing lessons that his brother's ease and confidence could never teach. He understood how to read people, how to measure behavior, how to wait until circumstances offered leverage. Every lesson ignored became a hidden weapon, every insult a reminder of what could be reclaimed. The townspeople continued to reinforce the hierarchy, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps knowingly. Thomas's successes were shared with pride. Jonah's labor was taken for granted, often overlooked entirely. Yet this public inequality only strengthened the patience and quiet resolve of the boy in shadow. He had learned that power was not always loud or recognized, and that sometimes the strongest moves were invisible until executed with precision. While Thomas thrived openly, Jonah prepared silently. By late adolescence, Thomas's entitlement had begun to shape his character more profoundly. He spoke with authority beyond his years, expected compliance from anyone near him, and assumed that every advantage was his by right. His confidence made him careless, often dismissive of his brother's presence, never pausing to notice the subtle glances, the silent calculations, the patience that sat just a few steps behind him. Jonah, in contrast, moved deliberately, always aware of the consequences of every act and the potential power in every situation. He had learned that enduring cruelty often provided knowledge that power alone could not grant. The father, still firmly devoted to the favored son, remained blind to the subtle currents that had begun to form in the household. Every act of indulgence, every word of praise, reinforced his belief that he had raised Thomas perfectly. He could not see that in ignoring Jonah, he had nurtured a quiet intelligence, a patience, and a strength that might one day challenge the very structures he had created. His pride in his chosen son blinded him to the seeds of future reckoning, seeds that had been growing quietly for years, unnoticed in plain sight. Within the household, tension was constant, though subtle. Thomas, secure in his father's favor, often mocked Jonah in minor ways. Light jokes about slowness or clumsiness, minor taunts meant to assert superiority. Jonah absorbed each one without reply, hiding his resentment beneath a calm exterior, carefully calculating every detail. Each act of cruelty or favoritism, once stored, became part of a hidden ledger, a map of advantage and leverage that would be understood fully only when the time came. The household had settled into a rhythm defined by inequality and observation. Thomas thrived in the warmth of selective affection, growing increasingly confident, proud, and self-assured. Jonah, lean, strong, and quiet, had cultivated patience, calculation, and understanding. He had endured every slight, every act of favoritism, every moment of exclusion, learning to read the patterns of those around him and to wait. In silence, he had grown stronger than anyone imagined, not in muscle alone, but in the awareness of how power and cruelty could be measured, understood, and eventually returned. The contrast between the sons was no longer subtle. One thrived in light, praised openly, and shielded from consequence. The other moved through shadow, strong and deliberate, carrying the memory of every injustice, storing knowledge as carefully as water is stored in a jar for drought. Every glance of disdain, every act of favoritism, every punishment withheld from one and given to the other had been recorded in the mind of the scorned son, preparing him for a reckoning that would one day arrive, unstoppable and absolute. Even as Thomas prepared to assume the family's legacy, unaware of the storm gathering beside him, Jonah's quiet patience set the stage for the inevitable. He had endured cruelty, prejudice, and selective love, and in doing so, had cultivated a power invisible to those around him. The farm, the family, the patterns of favoritism, and scorn, they all fed into a reckoning that had been growing for years, one that the favored son and the father who raised him could never see coming. And so the farm continued under the harsh sun, a microcosm of inequality and endurance, shaping both sons in profoundly different ways. One learned entitlement and arrogance, the other learned observation and patience. One would inherit land and praise, the other would inherit understanding and timing. And though it was invisible now, though it moved quietly and deliberately, the balance of power had already begun to shift, like a shadow creeping across the sun-baked fields, waiting for the moment when reckoning would come for the first time. By the early 1900s, the farm was a place where every glance, every gesture, and every word reinforced a hierarchy that had been established years before. Thomas had grown into a young man whose confidence bordered on arrogance, his every step and word shaped by constant praise and indulgence. He moved freely through the fields, charming, assured, and largely oblivious to the quiet shadow that moved just behind him. To him, the world itself seemed to bend to his will, every success a confirmation of his destiny. The townspeople treated him with deference, unaware of the simmering patience in the boy who labored silently, enduring and observing in equal measure. Jonah, lean and unassuming, had grown stronger than anyone imagined. His body was hardened by years of grueling labor, but it was his mind that had become sharper. He had learned to read gestures, tones, and subtle shifts in behavior. Every punishment, every slight, every act of favoritism that had been thrust upon him was stored meticulously in memory, catalogued as though for a ledger that would one day be consulted with precision. The injustice he endured had become the foundation for a quiet strength, one that was invisible, deliberate, and patient, He began to test boundaries, subtle experiments to gauge reactions and measure influence. A task done a little too slowly. A word spoken quietly to a farmhand. A suggestion offered in passing. Each act was carefully considered. He observed how Thomas reacted to minor delays, how the father corrected or praised, how others in the household responded to his small interventions. Every success, however invisible, reinforced the lesson that power often lay in subtlety, in influence without acknowledgement, in patient calculation. Thomas, by contrast, grew increasingly careless. The constant praise he received made him bold, even reckless. He delegated responsibilities without thought, assumed obedience without verification, and treated the workers and those around him with casual arrogance. Each careless action revealed weaknesses in the household's structure that Jonah silently noted. Thomas was blind to the slow accumulation of quiet power, building just out of sight, confident that favoritism and privilege would shield him from consequence. Harrison, still deeply devoted to the favored son, remained oblivious to the shifting dynamics. Every indulgence, every word of praise, every shield from failure was interpreted as proof of his own wisdom. He did not see that in neglecting Jonah. He had cultivated a mind capable of careful observation, patient strategy, and deliberate influence. Pride and blindness had combined to create a situation in which the very hierarchy he had enforced could be challenged, not through confrontation, but through patience and timing. Jonah's understanding of timing grew sharper with each passing day. He observed Thomas not only in public moments, but also in private frustrations, noting how easily he lost temper, how quickly impatience surfaced, and how his arrogance dictated predictable behavior. Every interaction, every small indulgence, every slight misstep became part of a mental map, a guide for the slow, deliberate exertion of influence when the moment arrived. He had learned that direct confrontation was futile. Power, when accumulated quietly, often had a more lasting effect. The village continued to reinforce the contrast between the brothers. Thomas was celebrated openly, invited to events, praised for accomplishments both large and small. Jonah's labor, quiet and vital, remained largely unacknowledged. Yet in the invisibility lay freedom. He could plan, observe, and maneuver without interference. Every favor shown to Thomas, every reprimand or act of neglect experienced by himself, became part of a growing strategy. Jonah understood that patience and subtlety often carried more weight than loud displays of entitlement. By now, Thomas's arrogance had hardened into recklessness. He assumed that compliance, respect, and admiration were his by right. Small mistakes were shrugged off, minor lapses excused. Each act of indulgence reinforced his sense of invincibility. Yet every careless act, every unobserved flaw, every overlooked opportunity became fodder for Jonah's calculations. The very overconfidence that allowed Thomas to thrive would, in time, become a weakness he could exploit. Harrison remained convinced of his son's perfection. Every smile, every compliment, every moment of indulgence confirmed that his judgment had been infallible. He could not see the growing intelligence and patience in the son he had dismissed, the slow accumulation of knowledge, observation, and quiet influence. Pride blinded him to the reality that cruelty, when ignored, can foster not only endurance but strategy and understanding that surpasses mere obedience. Jonah's influence began to manifest in subtle ways. Farmhands began to listen to his quiet suggestions. Small corrections improved efficiency without overt recognition, and neighbors occasionally sought his insight, though never acknowledging it openly. Each unnoticed success reinforced the understanding that power could exist without validation, and patience often yielded results faster than overt displays of authority. The contrast between visibility and invisibility, indulgence and neglect, became increasingly pronounced as the years passed. The farm itself mirrored these dynamics. Thomas was assigned fertile plots, given tools of the highest quality, allowed freedom to experiment, and shielded from the consequences of error. Jonah, tethered to barren soil and the most grueling labor, had been forced to develop a meticulous understanding of the land, the timing of harvests, and the subtleties of work. Knowledge, observation, and patience became his silent arsenal, shaping a power that was invisible but undeniable. Even minor incidents highlighted the growing tension. Thomas, confident and indulgent, often made careless mistakes, mismanaged tools, forgotten instructions, or misjudged crops. Each lapse went unnoticed or was quickly excused by Harrison, further feeding his arrogance. Jonah, always present, recorded each error silently, mapping patterns, anticipating consequences, and learning the timing of influence. He understood that reckoning required patience, not impulse, and that subtle accumulation of power was often more effective than immediate confrontation. As adolescence gave way to young adulthood, the differences between the brothers could not have been more stark. Thomas thrived openly, celebrated and shielded from consequence, his every action a reflection of the household's favoritism. Jonah thrived quietly, accumulating understanding, patience, and subtle authority that went unnoticed by the very people who believed themselves untouchable. Every act of cruelty endured, every favor withheld, and every indulgence observed became part of a plan growing steadily in the shadows. The household remained outwardly orderly, but the invisible dynamics had shifted. Thomas's overconfidence, combined with his entitlement, created predictable patterns. Jonah's observation and patient calculation made him a force no one had anticipated. Harrison, still blind to the growing power beside his favored son, could not see that the seeds of reckoning were already taking root. In the quiet patience of the scorned son lay a strategy that would one day reshape the very hierarchy that had oppressed him. Even as Thomas assumed his position as the inevitable heir, Jonah's quiet influence spread slowly, subtly altering relationships, correcting inefficiencies, and gaining loyalty through unseen means. The contrast was stark. One son overtly powerful and celebrated, the other quietly influential and deliberate. Every slight, every act of favoritism, every failure to acknowledge labor or intelligence had become part of an intricate web of understanding, knowledge, and calculated patience. The farm was more than land and labor. It was a stage for the slow, inevitable reckoning. Thomas moved in confidence, blind to the subtle accumulation of influence in the boy he had long dismissed. Jonah, patient, observant, and deliberate, carried a knowledge born of cruelty, neglect, and favoritism. He had endured years of injustice and had learned the patterns of human behavior, the timing of opportunity, and the subtle exertion of unseen power. In silence, he had built the foundations of control, waiting for the moment when years of observation and calculation would converge into inevitable consequence. By the time Thomas reached the prime of his youth, his confidence had evolved into something bordering on arrogance. He assumed the world's compliance as naturally as breathing, convinced that every advantage he had received was proof of his inherent superiority. He moved through the fields with careless ease, issuing commands, accepting praise without thought, and ignoring the quiet presence of Jonah, who followed closely behind. Each act of recklessness, from mismanaged tasks to poorly calculated decisions, was unnoticed by the father, who had long since placed all his faith in Thomas. Jonah had spent years in silence, observing every gesture, cataloging every weakness, and measuring the consequences of every action. The meticulous ledger in his mind was now dense with knowledge. The father's predictable indulgences, the favored son's patterns of arrogance, and the subtle loyalties of farmhands and neighbors. He understood that influence did not always require acknowledgement. In small, deliberate moves, He began to shape outcomes that Thomas assumed were solely the result of his own decisions. Small shifts in the household began to emerge. When Thomas delegated tasks without thought, Jonah subtly adjusted methods to avoid disaster. When the favored son left instructions incomplete, Jonah corrected errors quietly, allowing the work to succeed without attracting attention. Farmhands, who had long been instructed to follow Thomas's commands unquestioningly, began to notice Jonah's insight and guidance. Though it remained invisible to the father and Thomas, his influence was growing. Harrison, still proud of Thomas, remained blind to these changes. Each success, each moment of praise, each indulgence reinforced his belief in the wisdom of favoritism. He could not perceive that the quiet boy he had dismissed was shaping the household's order in subtle, deliberate ways. Pride, long unchallenged, had left him unprepared for the reckoning quietly taking form beneath his nose. Thomas's overconfidence made him increasingly reckless. He ignored minor warnings, relied on routine, and assumed loyalty without effort. Each oversight, each miscalculation, became another opportunity for Jonah to assert influence quietly. Where Thomas's arrogance led him to expect immediate compliance, Jonah's patience allowed him to prepare for long-term advantage. Every unrecognized act of observation became a step toward eventual control, a slow and invisible accumulation of power. In the village, the contrast between the sons was evident to anyone with a discerning eye. Thomas received public praise for achievements large and small, while Jonah's work went largely unnoticed. Yet his quiet authority was subtly expanding. A farmhand might follow a suggestion he whispered in passing, or a neighbor might take heed of advice he offered without fanfare. Influence had shifted from visibility to subtlety, from entitlement to earned respect. Though Thomas remained blind to it, the tension in the household grew more palpable with each passing season. Thomas, intoxicated by praise and indulgence, acted with less caution, trusting entirely in his own judgment. Jonah, lean and deliberate, continued to observe, record, and act with precision. Every act of favoritism, every insult endured, every error unnoticed by the father was now a tool for him, each moment adding to a growing understanding of timing and consequence. Even the smallest acts began to demonstrate Jonah's growing power. When Thomas mismanaged irrigation, Jonah corrected it quietly, preventing crop loss without acknowledgement. When Thomas angered a farmhand, Jonah diffused tension before it escalated. These actions went unnoticed by the father, whose blind trust in the favored son allowed Jonah's influence to grow unchecked. What had once been silent endurance had transformed into subtle mastery, invisible but undeniable. The favored son, however, remained oblivious to the shifts occurring around him. His arrogance made him predictable. His entitlement blinded him to subtle manipulation, and his confidence convinced him that the world was incapable of challenging him. Every indulgence reinforced his sense of superiority. Every act of kindness from the father seemed to confirm that his success was absolute. Yet, beneath the surface, the balance of power had begun to tilt. Jonah's patience had allowed him to cultivate trust among those who worked alongside him. Farmhands, neighbors, and even local merchants began to notice his competence, reliability, and quiet insight. None challenged Thomas openly, and none acknowledged Jonah's growing authority. But they began to rely on him. He had learned the subtle art of influence, how to guide outcomes without attracting attention, how to shape decisions while remaining invisible, and how to prepare for a moment when the reckoning would be undeniable. Harrison's pride continued to blind him. Every praise offered to Thomas, every indulgence granted, every excuse for carelessness was interpreted as confirmation of good judgment. He could not see that in nurturing one son and dismissing the other, he had created a patient, calculating force, one capable of overturning the carefully constructed hierarchy he had spent decades reinforcing. His favoritism, long unquestioned, had planted the seeds of its own undoing. As Thomas entered adulthood, his arrogance reached its peak. He assumed he was untouchable, capable of commanding loyalty, respect, and affection simply because he was favored. Each careless decision reinforced Jonah's strategy. Each overlooked detail provided him with an opportunity to act subtly. And though the favored son thrived in the warmth of approval, he remained blind to the quiet storm accumulating beside him, a storm built on years of endurance, observation, and patient calculation. Jonah's subtle influence continued to expand. Instructions he offered quietly were followed, mistakes he corrected silently went unnoticed, and his guidance became a backbone for the household's continued function. Thomas assumed credit for successes, while Jonah ensured they occurred. The father, still focused entirely on his chosen son, could not perceive the slow accumulation of power occurring in plain sight. Each unnoticed success was another thread in the web of eventual reckoning. The contrast between the sons could not have been more evident. Thomas thrived in recognition, confidence, and indulgence, oblivious to the growing influence of the boy he had long scorned. Jonah, lean and silent, had become indispensable without acknowledgement, patient and deliberate, calculating every action with precision. Every act of cruelty endured, every favor observed, every act of neglect catalogued, had become a tool for subtle mastery, even as Thomas assumed he would. Inherit the farm and the family's legacy without question. The invisible shifts were undeniable. Jonah's patience, knowledge, and calculated influence were forming a foundation for eventual confrontation. He had endured years of prejudice, scorn, and favoritism, and had learned that slow, deliberate action often outstrips recklessness and entitlement. The household, carefully ordered for generations, was already being reshaped in subtle, unseen ways. Harrison remained proud, blind to the currents beneath him. His perfect son, nurtured, praised, and indulged, seemed untouchable, yet the seeds of consequence had been quietly planted. Each act of favoritism, each moment of oversight, had contributed to a reckoning growing steadily in the shadows, and though Thomas was unaware, and Harrison still blinded by pride, the balance of influence had begun to shift, imperceptibly but inexorably, setting the stage for events that neither could have anticipated. The farm had settled into a rhythm defined by unequal favor and quiet calculation. Thomas moved through it with the confidence of someone certain of his invincibility. Every decision he made, every task he delegated, every small success he claimed, reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. He had grown careless, assuming that the world, the workers, and even his father were extensions of his entitlement. No error seemed too small to overlook, no lapse too minor to escape his attention, because, in his arrogance, he believed that consequences would bend to his favor. Jonah, meanwhile, continued to cultivate patience and precision. Years of labor, neglect, and scorn had sharpened his mind into something deliberate and exact. Every slight, every act of favoritism, every punishment endured, had become material for strategy. He began to take small, deliberate steps, subtle actions designed to influence outcomes without attracting notice. He corrected minor mistakes Thomas had ignored, guided the farmhands quietly, and adjusted details that no one else would notice, all while remaining in the shadows. Each small success reinforced his understanding that influence often outweighed visibility. Harrison remained blinded by pride. Every indulgence he offered Thomas, every word of praise, every shield from consequence was taken as confirmation of his own wisdom. He did not perceive the quiet accumulation of power beside him, the slow, deliberate shaping of the household's outcomes by the son he had long dismissed. In nurturing the favored child and neglecting the other, Harrison had unintentionally forged a patient, calculating force, one capable of overturning the very hierarchy he believed immutable. Thomas grew increasingly reckless. He expected immediate compliance from workers, neighbors, and his father alike. He delegated carelessly, assumed loyalty without verification, and flaunted his position as if the world owed him nothing less than obedience. Every careless act became an opportunity for Jonah, while Thomas assumed his successes were his own. Every minor adjustment, every subtle correction, every quietly guided decision ensured that the outcomes he took credit for were actually shaped by the scorned son's deliberate influence. Jonah began to test limits. When a task Thomas delegated was mismanaged, he intervened silently, correcting errors before they became visible problems. When tensions arose among the farmhands, he diffused them without acknowledgement. Each act was a calculated measure of influence and power, invisible to those who believed that visibility equaled authority. Thomas remained unaware and Harrison remained blind, convinced that every success confirmed his wisdom. The contrast between the brothers became increasingly stark. Thomas thrived in public recognition, confidence, and indulgence. Jonah thrived quietly, his patience and observation allowing him to shape the household in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The farm became a microcosm of invisible power. One son relying on entitlement and indulgence, the other building influence in silence, cataloging every detail, preparing for a reckoning that neither the father nor the favored son could yet imagine. Even the smallest details were leveraged by Jonah. Tools left in disarray by Thomas were reorganized without comment. Minor oversights in the fields were corrected silently. Farmhands began to follow his guidance instinctively, even if they still outwardly deferred to Thomas. Influence, he understood, was not measured in praise but in effect. Every act of unseen control built toward a future moment when the balance of power would shift. Thomas, intoxicated by confidence, continued to assume invincibility. He made errors that would have been catastrophic in less forgiving hands, yet each one was quietly managed by Jonah. The favored son remained unaware that the outcomes he claimed as his own were actually shaped by the patient, calculating presence moving in the shadows beside him. Harrison, proud and blind, failed to see that his carefully nurtured hierarchy was already fracturing, that his favored son's arrogance had created predictable vulnerabilities, and that the scorned son's quiet accumulation of power would eventually overturn everything he believed secure. Jonah's influence spread beyond the household. Farmhands, neighbors, and merchants began to respect his insight and reliability, even if it was never acknowledged openly. He had learned that respect and authority could exist without visibility, that patience and calculation could outweigh entitlement and indulgence. Every silent intervention, every unnoticed correction, every subtle act of guidance increased his quiet authority, setting the stage for eventual confrontation. The tension in the household was almost imperceptible, but constant. Thomas, oblivious to the subtle shifts around him, continued to act with careless confidence. Every indulgence, every shield from consequence, every act of favoritism reinforced his arrogance, making him predictable, while Jonah's patience and observation ensured that the invisible currents of influence were steadily shifting. Harrison, still blind, believed that his perfect son was untouchable, unaware that the seeds of reckoning had already been planted and nurtured for years. Jonah began to lay the groundwork for deliberate action. Minor mistakes by Thomas were quietly corrected, subtly undermining the favored son's control without exposing his own hand. Instructions whispered to farmhands in passing began to shape decisions in ways Thomas assumed were entirely his own. The scorned son's patience had matured into strategy, every action calculated, every moment observed, every detail stored for a future when consequence would arrive. Even the land itself became a tool in Jonah's subtle strategy. He learned to anticipate the timing of crops, the needs of animals, and the labor patterns of workers. Where Thomas acted impulsively or carelessly, Jonah's quiet interventions ensured stability. Each unnoticed success reinforced the lesson that true power could exist without acknowledgement, that influence mattered more than entitlement, and that patience could achieve what arrogance never could. Thomas remained blind. Every act of favoritism, every indulgence, every moment of praise seemed to confirm his invincibility. He assumed that the household, the farm, and even the people around him would bend to his will simply because he was favored. But beneath the surface, the balance of power was shifting imperceptibly. Jonah's patience, observation, and strategic influence had grown into a force invisible but undeniable, poised to reshape the household in ways neither the father nor the favored son could foresee. Harrison's pride continued to obscure reality. He remained convinced that the hierarchy he had established was absolute, that favoritism guaranteed loyalty, and that indulgence ensured success. Yet every unnoticed act by Jonah, every subtle intervention, every correction carried out in silence, was a step toward undermining the very structure Harrison had built. The careful nurturing of one son and the neglect of the other had unintentionally created a patient, calculating force capable of overturning his expectations. Even as Thomas assumed control, the quiet influence of the scorned son spread through the household and beyond. Farmhands followed his guidance instinctively. Minor disasters were averted by his interventions, and subtle shifts in the management of labor and resources allowed him to exercise control without ever attracting attention. Influence had grown invisible, patient and deliberate, and with it, the stage was set for the inevitable reckoning that would one day confront both the favored son and the father who had nurtured him. By the time the season of harvest arrived, the differences between the brothers were undeniable, though invisible to those blinded by entitlement and pride. Thomas relied on public recognition, indulgence, and entitlement. Jonah relied on patience, observation, and subtle influence. Every act of cruelty endured, every favor observed, every oversight catalogued, had been transformed into a strategic advantage. The invisible currents of power were now strong enough to shift outcomes, and the household was poised on the brink of change. The farm, sun-baked and orderly, had become a landscape of invisible strategy. Thomas moved through it believing himself untouchable, while Jonah shaped outcomes quietly, correcting mistakes, guiding hands, and ensuring the smooth function of the land. Harrison remained proud, blind to the subtle manipulation and patient accumulation of influence. The seeds of future reckoning had been nurtured for years, quietly, invisibly, and deliberately, and they were now approaching maturity. Time had only sharpened the contrast between the two sons. Thomas, once favored and now fully grown, moved through the farm with unchallenged confidence, his arrogance now a hardened shell. Every decision, every action, every minor success reinforced the belief that entitlement equaled ability. He rarely paused to consider consequences, assuming that his father's indulgence and the household's structure would protect him from error. To the casual observer, he was the undisputed heir, the image of power nurtured by years of praise and selective favoritism. Jonah, in contrast, had transformed patience into a weapon. Years of scorn, neglect, and invisibility had honed his mind into a precise instrument of observation and strategy. Every insult endured, every act of favoritism ignored, every punishment catalogued became part of a mental blueprint for influence. He had learned the rhythms of the household, the predictable reactions of his brother, and the father's blind indulgence. Quietly, deliberately, he began to assert control, not through confrontation but through subtle, unavoidable influence that reshaped outcomes without drawing attention. The first signs of shift appeared in minor but undeniable ways. When Thomas left tasks incomplete, Jonah corrected them silently, ensuring success while remaining unseen. Farmhands, once loyal only to the favored son, began to recognize Jonah's competence and followed his guidance instinctively, though never openly acknowledging it. Small interventions, adjusting irrigation, reorganizing tools, offering quiet advice, began to tilt outcomes subtly. Thomas assumed the results were his own doing, unaware that the foundations of his authority were being quietly undermined. Harrison remained as blind as ever. His pride in Thomas had become absolute, blinding him to the quiet power developing under his nose. Every indulgence, every moment of praise, every shield from consequence reinforced his sense of infallibility. He did not see that in nurturing one son and neglecting the other. He had cultivated a patient, calculating force, capable of reshaping the very hierarchy he had built. Thomas, now reckless in his confidence, made errors that might once have gone unnoticed. He mismanaged harvest schedules, delegated poorly, and assumed the unquestioned loyalty of workers. Each misstep provided Jonah an opportunity to guide outcomes without acknowledgement. Every small correction, every unseen adjustment, strengthened the scorned son's influence, while deepening the favored son's obliviousness. The village, too, began to reflect subtle changes. Thomas continued to receive public recognition, invitations, and praise. Jonah's influence was largely invisible but undeniable. Farmhands and neighbors relied on his judgment quietly, taking his advice to heart without crediting him. In these unseen shifts, Jonah built the foundation for a reckoning that would eventually confront the arrogance and entitlement nurtured over decades. Harrison's blindness grew with his pride. He saw only the surface, Thomas's public accomplishments, the appearances of order on the farm, the compliance of workers. He could not perceive the quiet manipulation, the subtle corrections, the patient guidance ensuring that Thomas's errors never became catastrophic. In nurturing the favored son, he had unwittingly strengthened the scorned son's capacity for influence and control. Jonah began to apply his strategy more deliberately. Small failures by Thomas were quietly corrected. Minor disputes among workers were diffused under his guidance, and overlooked errors in the field were managed without acknowledgement. Each intervention increased his invisible authority. The favored son, unaware and overconfident, continued to believe the world was shaped entirely by his own actions. Harrison remained blind to the quiet storm growing beneath the surface, convinced that the hierarchy he had established was unassailable. The contrast between the sons could not have been clearer. Thomas relied on entitlement, indulgence, and visibility. Jonah relied on patience, observation, and invisible influence. The farm became a stage for these competing forces, each moving according to its own rhythm. Thomas assumed control because he had been chosen. Jonah prepared to seize influence because he had endured. Every act of cruelty, every favor denied, every insult absorbed, and every indulgence witnessed was now a tool in a carefully orchestrated strategy. Even the land itself reflected the invisible struggle. Thomas made impulsive decisions about planting, irrigation, and labor assignments. Jonah adjusted the outcomes silently, ensuring productivity while remaining unnoticed. Where Thomas assumed credit, Jonah had ensured success. Where Thomas failed to see the consequences of his own mistakes, Jonah quietly prevented disaster. Every step he took reinforced the lesson that influence, patience, and observation could outweigh visibility, entitlement, and indulgence. As the seasons passed, Thomas's arrogance deepened. Every indulgence he received, every minor success celebrated, reinforced the belief that he was untouchable. He believed the household, the workers, and even his father were extensions of his authority. Yet beneath the surface, the household was no longer controlled solely by his entitlement. Jonah's quiet interventions, his patient observation, and his subtle manipulations had begun to shape the farm's outcomes in ways that Thomas could neither see nor anticipate. Harrison, proud and blind, continued to shield Thomas from consequence. Every indulgence, every word of praise, every overlooked error reinforced the father's belief in the favored son's perfection. He did not perceive the careful accumulation of power occurring in silence, nor did he recognize that the son he had neglected had quietly become indispensable. Every act of favoritism had, paradoxically, ensured that the scorned son's patience and calculation could now challenge the very hierarchy. Harrison believed untouchable. Jonah's influence had spread beyond the household. Workers relied on his guidance instinctively. Neighbors sought his advice quietly, and even small errors by Thomas were corrected under his direction. No one openly acknowledged his authority, but the outcomes demonstrated it unmistakably. He had learned that power could exist without recognition, that patience and subtlety often outpaced arrogance and entitlement, and that the seeds of eventual reckoning were planted not in confrontation, but in deliberate, unseen control. The tension within the household, though invisible to Harrison, became increasingly palpable. Thomas, intoxicated by privilege, continued to act recklessly, unaware that his successes were quietly shaped by the very person he had scorned. Jonah's silent mastery allowed him to ensure the household's function, protect the land and influence the people around him. Each unnoticed correction, each invisible intervention, each moment of patient strategy increased his authority while reinforcing Thomas's blindness. Even minor incidents served Jonah's growing influence. Mismanaged tools were reorganized, minor disputes resolved, and instructions clarified, all without acknowledgement. Farmhands followed his guidance instinctively, their loyalty shifting subtly, imperceptibly. Every unseen success strengthened the lesson that power could exist without visibility, that influence mattered more than entitlement, and that patience could achieve what arrogance never could. Thomas remained confident, blind to the subtle manipulation occurring around him. Every indulgence reinforced his belief in invincibility. Yet every small error he made, every oversight, every lapse in judgment provided Jonah another opportunity to exercise quiet control. The hierarchy Harrison believed unbreakable had already begun to shift, the seeds of consequence quietly germinating beneath the surface. As the harvest approached, the differences between the brothers became undeniable to anyone perceptive enough to notice. Thomas relied on visibility, entitlement, and indulgence. Jonah relied on patience, observation, and influence exercised in silence. The land itself, the workers, and even the rhythms of the household were subtly under his control. Every act of cruelty endured, every favor observed, every slight catalogued had become part of a strategy that would one day confront both arrogance and pride. The farm, long shaped by favoritism, had become a landscape of invisible power. Thomas assumed he ruled it because he had been chosen, while Jonah ensured its outcomes through careful, deliberate, and unseen action. Harrison remained proud, blind to the subtle currents beneath him. The seeds of reckoning had been planted over decades of cruelty, neglect, and indulgence, and they were now approaching a point of maturity. The balance of power, long assumed to favor the favored son, had already begun to tilt imperceptibly but irrevocably toward the patient, scorned son who had endured in silence. Years had passed, and the farm carried the weight of generations, yet its surface order masked the shifting undercurrents beneath. Thomas, now fully grown, moved with the confidence of someone certain of his superiority. He assumed that every laborer, every neighbor, and even his father existed to affirm his entitlement. He made decisions impulsively, delegated carelessly, and flaunted his position with a pride that bordered on arrogance. To the outside eye, he was the undisputed heir, the perfect culmination of favor, indulgence, and privilege. But beneath the polished surface, cracks had begun to form. Jonah, lean and deliberate, had transformed years of cruelty and neglect into quiet mastery. Every insult endured, every act of favoritism ignored, and every punishment catalogued became part of a strategy he had been cultivating for decades. He understood the household with an intimacy no one else possessed. The father's predictable indulgences, the brother's recklessness, and the unspoken loyalties of those around them. Where Thomas moved with blind confidence, Jonah moved with deliberate calculation, ensuring that the farm's outcomes aligned with his subtle influence. The first signs of true change emerged quietly. When Thomas delegated carelessly, minor mistakes arose, but they were subtly corrected by Jonah before disaster could strike. When tensions flared among the workers due to Thomas's impatience or neglect, Jonah diffused them silently, ensuring that loyalty remained intact. Farmhands, who had long deferred to Thomas, now instinctively followed Jonah's guidance, though they never acknowledged it openly. His influence, invisible yet undeniable, had grown so substantial that the favored son remained blissfully unaware. Harrison remained proud, blind to the subtle transformation occurring in his household. Every indulgence, every moment of praise for Thomas, every shield from consequence reinforced his belief in his own wisdom. He could not see that the scorned son he had dismissed had quietly become indispensable. Every act of favoritism, every neglected opportunity to teach accountability had allowed Jonah to cultivate patience, observation, and influence, slowly reshaping the dynamics Harrison had assumed were immutable. Thomas's arrogance intensified with age. He assumed the world's obedience, making decisions with reckless confidence and delegating responsibilities without thought. Every error, from mismanaged crops to forgotten instructions, provided Jonah with opportunities to act subtly. Each intervention reinforced the invisible authority he had been cultivating, while Thomas remained entirely unaware that the successes he claimed were often orchestrated in silence. The farm itself mirrored the invisible struggle. Where Thomas made impulsive, careless decisions, Jonah adjusted outcomes with quiet precision. Irrigation was corrected, tools were organized, and labor schedules were subtly altered to prevent failure. Every unnoticed act of influence increased his authority and reinforced the lesson that true power often lies in observation, patience, and quiet action rather than entitlement, recognition, or indulgence. Harrison's blindness persisted. He continued to see only what he wanted: the favored son's public accomplishments, the outward appearances of order, and the illusion of control. He could not perceive the steady accumulation of influence beneath the surface, nor did he realize that the boy he had scorned had become the backbone of the farm's stability. Every indulgence, every act of favoritism, and every overlooked error had paradoxically strengthened the very force capable of dismantling the household hierarchy Harrison had built. Jonah's influence spread beyond the immediate household. Workers, neighbors, and merchants began to rely on his judgment instinctively, though never openly acknowledging him. Small errors by Thomas were corrected without attention. Disputes were resolved quietly, and the farm continued to operate smoothly under Jonah's unseen hand. He had mastered the art of invisible control, shaping outcomes, guiding actions, and ensuring success while remaining hidden in the shadows. The tension in the household, though invisible to Harrison, became palpable in subtle ways. Thomas, intoxicated by privilege and overconfidence, continued to act recklessly, unaware that the outcomes he claimed were his own were quietly manipulated by the very son he had scorned. Jonah, deliberate and patient, had accumulated authority invisible but undeniable. Every overlooked error, every small correction, and every strategic Intervention increased his power while keeping him concealed. Even minor incidents began to highlight the shift. Mismanaged tools were reorganized, mistakes in the fields corrected, and disputes among farmhands resolved without acknowledgement. Every subtle act strengthened Jonah's authority and demonstrated that influence, patience and observation could outweigh entitlement, indulgence and visibility. He had learned that power does not require recognition, only effect, and that patient calculation can overturn the reckless arrogance of those who believe themselves untouchable. Thomas remained blind to the shifts occurring around him. Every indulgence and every moment of praise reinforced his belief in invincibility. Yet each error he made, every misjudgment, every lapse in accountability gave Jonah another opportunity to exercise quiet control. The household's hierarchy, assumed by Harrison to favor Thomas absolutely, had already begun to tilt. The seeds of consequence planted long ago through cruelty, neglect and favoritism were now nearing full maturity. As the years progressed, the differences between the sons became undeniable in effect, though invisible to Harrison. Thomas relied entirely on visibility, entitlement and indulgence, assuming his authority was inherent. Jonah relied on patience, observation and subtle influence, ensuring the household functioned while maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. Every insult endured, every favor observed, and every slight catalogued had become part of a careful strategy designed to confront arrogance and pride when the moment was right. The farm itself, sun-baked and orderly, was a stage for these competing forces. Thomas assumed he controlled it because of his status, while Jonah quietly ensured that the outcomes aligned with his own. Careful planning. Harrison remained oblivious, blind to the slow accumulation of influence and the subtle realignment of loyalty among those who worked the land. The reckoning had been years in the making, nurtured in silence, patience and observation, and now it approached the point of inevitability. Jonah's influence had grown so subtle yet powerful that even Thomas's mistakes could no longer destabilize the household without Jonah's intervention. The favored son assumed authority, yet the scorned son now controlled the levers of power invisibly. Farmhands instinctively deferred to Jonah when Thomas faltered. Neighbors quietly sought his guidance, and minor crises were averted by his unseen hand. Every silent action, every unseen correction, every subtle manipulation strengthened his authority, while deepening Thomas's oblivion. Harrison's pride, once unquestioned, began to show cracks, though he still could not fully perceive them. Minor disruptions, slight inconsistencies, and the subtle competence of Jonah occasionally unsettled him, though he attributed them to chance or luck. The father remained convinced that Thomas's favored status guaranteed control, unaware that the boy he had long scorned now wielded influence, invisible but absolute. Every act of favoritism, every indulgence, and every overlooked misstep had prepared the scorned son for the reckoning Harrison had never anticipated. As harvest time came again, the invisible power dynamics crystallized. Thomas moved through the farm with entitlement, still confident in his invincibility, while Jonah's patience and deliberate influence ensured that every process, every decision, and every labor outcome reflected his subtle mastery. The household was poised on the edge of change, one son basking in the illusions of favor, the other quietly controlling the structure upon which the favored son's confidence depended. The difference in approach could not have been more pronounced. Thomas relied on privilege, recognition, and indulgence, oblivious to the slow shift in authority beneath him. Jonah relied on patience, observation, and careful strategy, turning years of cruelty, neglect, and invisibility into a framework of control. Every unseen correction, every subtle act of guidance, and every silent intervention brought the day closer when reckoning would arrive. Finally, the farm itself became a testament to Jonah's influence. Crops thrived under his unseen adjustments. Tools were organized to prevent errors, and labor was guided with invisible precision. Thomas assumed credit, oblivious to the hand orchestrating success behind the scenes. Harrison, proud yet increasingly unsettled, could not perceive the accumulation of power he had fostered in silence. The seeds of consequence planted decades before had grown into a force that could no longer be ignored. The reckoning, long prepared in patience, observation, and subtle influence, had reached its tipping point. Thomas's arrogance, entitlement, and carelessness had created vulnerabilities Jonah could exploit without confrontation. Harrison's pride and blindness had unwittingly nurtured the instrument of his own eventual humiliation. And the scorned son, patient and deliberate, had transformed years of cruelty and neglect into a quiet but absolute authority that would one day confront both favoritism and arrogance with precision and inevitability.